it's easy to get starstruck with the big companies doing the big, amazing projects. But in fact, if it comes down to trying to learn your craft early on, if you can work at a small scale for the first few years of your career, it's actually quite valuable.
Welcome to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers Podcast. Each episode will bring you conversations from business leaders and up-and-coming stars in the commercial real estate industry in Canada. Our guests will share their unique career journeys, passions, and advice on what it takes to be successful in this industry. This podcast is brought to you by Highview Partners, connecting people who perform in Canadian real estate.
I'm your host, Richard Costello, and today I'm pleased to introduce Michael Heeney. Michael is a renowned city builder, architect, and urban strategist with over 25 years of experience guiding organizations and leading diverse projects. Currently with C+O Advisory Inc., Michael Heeney is the past president and CEO of the Surrey City Development Corporation, SCDC. Prior to his work at SCDC, for over 2 decades, Michael was the managing principal of Thom Architects, where he oversaw the growth of that practice into an internationally significant design firm with offices in Vancouver, Washington, D.C., and Hong Kong. Michael is passionate about enhancing communities through innovative urban design and architecture and sees the importance of creativity and culture in contributing to the health and vitality of urban centres. Michael, you've presented at many different conferences, organizations and universities throughout the world. So it's a great privilege to have you join us today on our humble Real Estate Careers podcast.
I'm delighted to be here, Richard.
Well, thank you. And not to kick this off by aging you right off the bat, Michael, but you've been at the forefront of architecture and design in Vancouver for the past 30 years. As a city, Vancouver seems to be in an exciting phase of building design. It feels like every few months we see these amazing renderings for the latest high-rise tower project. So I'm interested to get your thoughts, first of all, on how you think the city is currently taking shape.
Well, I actually think that the last 30 years have been pretty exciting for Vancouver, and that, as you pointed out, that sort of aligns with my career in some respects. Although I'd like to point out that 30 years is actually quite short in terms of design and development because projects take a long time. It's not unusual for projects to take a decade to happen. So it takes a bit of time before you've actually seen enough to be able to really speak intelligently about and understand cities. But for getting back to Vancouver, I think a seminal moment in Vancouver was when we had the World Exposition in 1986, which is, I guess, a little bit over 30 years ago. But that really put Vancouver on the world stage, and it precipitated a significant amount of immigration, particularly from Asia, and it made us reconsider our city. I think the city became much more sophisticated, obviously more cosmopolitan with all of these new arrivals, and they also were more interested, or not interested, but they were comfortable living in much denser arrangements than historically I think people in Vancouver had wanted to live in, and about that same time there was a very kind of fertile period of planning in Vancouver. There are a couple of very famous planners, Ray Spaxman, followed by Larry Beasley and Anne McAfee, who really sort of started looking at the city in a unique way for Vancouver. And this corresponded with massive redevelopment, in particular the Expo site itself, which became this massive new community where they got to experiment with new kinds of urban design and urban forms, and doing that in a very dense way. And of course, the market was there, so people were buying these towers and moving into them, and it evolved really quite quickly in about 15 to 20 years, which again is not a long time in terms of a city's life. We had this forest of glass, Douglas Copeland's sort of city of glass thing. That all happened, and these towers were all built about the same time. So they really were a product of the kind of economic and social and sort of political will of the time, which was maximizing views. And so these slim towers with lots of glass popped up. What's been interesting in Vancouver, and I'm talking really specifically about the city of Vancouver, is is as real estate has got more valuable, as more and more people have been coming into the city, it's allowed developers to actually spend a little bit more on the buildings, on the architecture. And if you look at other cities, older cities, perhaps more established cities, where the real estate value had grown up long in advance of Vancouver's, like say Tokyo or London or New York, perhaps. That you often got great examples of architecture there because relative to the cost of land, it didn't take a lot it made sense given the value of land to invest and build a really good building. And that's starting to happen now, particularly in the high end, or not now, probably over the last decade, particularly at the high end level. And you're starting to get some really interesting towers coming. And it's certainly at the forefront of that is Ian Gillespie and his company, Westbank. And they're really kind of, again, I think, recognizing that Vancouver truly is a global city, and so bringing in architects from around the world and doing buildings that are truly the best. In many ways, he set the bar for the rest of the industry who are following suit, and I think that's why you're starting to see some of these quite extraordinary buildings coming up around town.
Yeah, no, thank you. Do you have a favorite building in the city yourself of the modern times?
It's always hard if you're an architect to say what your favorite building is because there's a tendency to be a little bit critical of, of all the buildings. But I'd say what makes Vancouver special is actually the city itself, the city fabric, and the relationship with nature. It's hard to single out a building. I mean, I think if there's a building that I go out of my way to show people in Vancouver, and it's not even technically in the city of Vancouver, it would have to be the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. I mean, I think that's really one of the great buildings of the 20th century in the world, and we're fortunate enough to have it here.
That's enough about Vancouver for now. I wanted to chat to you about the City of Surrey, which I know you're very passionate about. You were part of the team, alongside Thom, that brought about the Central City project over 20 years ago, which for anyone unfamiliar is a mixed-use development right on the SkyTrain that houses a shopping mall, university campus, and an office tower. You also worked on the City Centre Library and Guildford Aquatic Centre projects. For the past 3.5 years, you were president and CEO of SCDC, tasked with accelerating the growth of the city through strategic real estate development. So, Michael, what do you think makes the City of Surrey so exciting for an architect and city builder like yourself?
Well, I think one of the things which is unique about this region, and I think it's very easy to get caught up in the kind of glamour of the city of Vancouver and forget about the region. But in fact, the region of Metro Vancouver is made up of what it's like 23 different municipalities and electoral areas and First Nations and things like that. And they're all actually relatively independent. And what's been interesting is the city of Vancouver represents less than a quarter of that in terms of population and far less in terms of area. What's interesting is a couple of things. One is a lot of the issues and stresses and successes of Vancouver don't necessarily relate to the rest of the region. So you have to think about the other 3/4 of the region. Yet we always have a tendency to see it through the eyes of Vancouver, and I was guilty of that myself until, as you mentioned, I got involved in some projects out in Surrey. But if we think for a minute, if we sort of set back and think of the region and forget about all of the municipal boundaries. As a region, we have a unique geography, and it's really quite unique in the world. We have our downtown, and the city of Vancouver is an extension really of the downtown, and that's on the western sort of periphery, on the perimeter of the city. And then on the north, we have the mountains, so that sort of constricts growth to the north. To the west, and even really wrapping around to the south, we have water, the ocean, and going into the Fraser River. And so what that means is that our city can only grow in kind of one direction, and that's really unique. I mean, if you think of most cities, or ideally an unconstrained city, say like Calgary or Atlanta or something like that, you have the center, which is typically where your downtown is, your central business district, and then the city can kind of radiate out from that in 360 degrees. And so That's good and bad. The good part is that you can cluster people closer to the city center. It's much more efficient because you're sort of going incrementally out in all directions. The bad news is it's very hard if you're a planner to try and figure out which direction is going to have primacy. You think, oh, where's the train lines, where are the roads, and things like that. But they tend to be man-made more than anything else. That determines where that priority is, and those things can change. So it's always a bit of a gamble about thinking where the growth is going to happen. So we have so our geography, our constraints have good and bad things about them. So the good, or maybe I should start with the bad thing. The challenge with our geography is that because we can only go in one direction, as the population grows, it's getting further and further and further away from the downtown where the majority of our jobs are. And so you can imagine that's incredibly inefficient. So all of our transit, all of our other infrastructure, people are having to drive further and further to get to the downtown. You would never rationally design a city like this with the downtown weight on a, but it's just the way history and geography have left us where we are. Now, the good thing about that is that we know which direction the growth is going to be. So we're not gambling about which direction is going to be the primary direction. We know that direction is going to be to the southeast. And if we look at the way the region has been planned, and there has been regional planning, the challenge is because there's no elected regional government, it doesn't have any teeth. It's sort of ultimately it's everyone's goodwill to follow the plan, but in the end, every mayor is accountable to their electorate. So if there's a conflict between priorities of different cities, it's very hard to make something happen. But what's interesting is you have Vancouver, then you go to Burnaby, then you cross the river, and you get into Surrey. And Surrey is quite interesting. It's 2.5 times the size of Vancouver physically. It's almost the same size in population now. That's maybe 10 or 15% smaller than Vancouver, but it's growing twice as fast. And again, it's sort of wrong to say it's just Vancouver, but that growth is in that direction. So if we I always like to talk about what I refer to as the centroid of the region. If you picked a point in Metro Vancouver where there's an equal number of people in all directions, in the 60s, that would have been in East Vancouver. But the last census in 2016, that point is around New Westminster Burnaby border, and it's moving to the southeast. And so again, that's proving this issue that people are getting further and further away from the downtown. And so Surrey was identified, or the Surrey City Centre, which is not in the center of Surrey, it's actually in North Surrey, was identified decades ago as being kind of the second downtown of the region, for just that reason. And then getting back to Expo, one of the great pieces of infrastructure that was a legacy of Expo was the Expo SkyTrain line. And that actually cemented a series of town centers. So it connected downtown Vancouver to Burnaby, to New Westminster, and then across the river to Surrey. And the idea was that these town centers would become business centers and take the kind of heat off everyone having to go all the way to Vancouver. And Surrey was always thought to be the largest of those because it also served all the communities south of the river, the Langleys, and all of those places. And for one reason or another, it never really caught on. And that project that you referred to, Central City, was the first sort of major project in Surrey City Centre, which sort of caught that wave. And it was very successful because it was sort of not a conventional project. You talked about it being mixed use, and what we had done is we took a kind of a declining shopping center, the Surrey Place Mall, and we added an office tower to that, and also a university. The university ultimately became Simon Fraser University, so it became the third of Simon Fraser's campuses. They have one up, the original one up on the mountain, Burnaby Mountain, then downtown Vancouver, and then Surrey became the next one. And what was interesting, what has been interesting watching that, is it's been a tremendously successful campus for SFU. I think in many ways they originally thought that it would be a satellite campus and to Burnaby, and they'd sort of get people, and then they get them going to the Burnaby campus. But what's been interesting to find is one of the things about Surrey growing so fast is it's very young. A third of the population is under 19. And of course, that's the market for post-secondary education. And so what they found is that they have the longest waiting lists of all their 3 campuses to get into the Surrey campus. You actually have to have the highest marks to get into the Surrey campus of SFU. They don't like to say that, but the Surrey students are smarter than the rest of the students on the campus. And I think that suddenly people woke up and they realized this pattern of growth that was happening. So I had a chance to take when I had a chance to take this job sort of 3.5 years ago. One of the reasons I jumped at the opportunity was it was a chance to actually build on this momentum, which had largely been ignored by the industry. And so there's an opportunity to kind of to tweak things and to do projects which sort of would bring attention and positive growth and really leverage on this natural growth, but to see if we could do it in a more logical and more effective way.
Well, in April of last year, the City of Surrey unfortunately made the decision to dissolve the Surrey City Development Corporation and bring all of its assets in-house. You commented in SCDC's 2019 annual report that the news was received with a great deal of disappointment. What can you tell us about the initiatives that SCDC was able to accomplish during its 13 years? And I guess, what do you hope its legacy will be 30 years from now?
Well, I mean, there's no question it was disappointing. Perhaps I should just step back and talk a little bit about SCDC. So SCDC is a municipal real estate company. It's operated as a for-profit real estate company, and it operates in many ways like a regular company. We're incorporated like any company. The company reported to an independent board of directors. There were 7 directors. 5 of them were independent, so really getting the best and brightest from the industry across the country. We had directors from Toronto and Ottawa and all over the place. The idea was to get the best minds advising us and making sure that we are operating in a proper way. And then the other 2 members represented our shareholder, which is the City of Surrey. So we were 100% owned by the City of Surrey, but we operated at arm's length. And so what we would do is we'd provide a business plan to the city every year, telling them what we were doing and what our kind of 5-year look ahead was. And then if we made any kind of significant transaction, anything over $5 million, we'd go back to council to make sure they're comfortable with it. So council had an opportunity to participate in the kind of high level direction, but otherwise we were quite independent and operating. And this company, and there are a lot of municipal land corporations, there are different kinds across the country. Surrey set theirs up. It was set up by Diane Watts, who was a remarkable mayor that Surrey had. I guess she first came into power about 14 years ago. And she really brought Surrey into the 21st century. And one of the initiatives she did was to create SCDC. She felt that they needed to advance the city quickly in some ways, and that government itself is perhaps, well, it's very good at delivering some things, other things where sort of private sector, more entrepreneurial model would work. They also had, they did like all cities, they occasionally have land that's surplus land and that they wanted to use that to raise revenue. And the advantage of having something like SCDC is that we could actually plan it and bring a lot of value to the land before it got sold, rather than just sell it in its raw state. And so SCDC so it operated quite entrepreneurial. I mean, we didn't, some municipal land development corporations get a kind of an operating grant or funds from the city. We didn't. The company had to be run quite entrepreneurial. We bought land from the city. We actually bought it at market. Originally it was at a preferred price, but over the years we started to pay market. And then we developed that land and did a number of things. One is we generated an annual dividend for the city, so we were actually contributing. I think by the end of last year, we'd contributed $36 million to the city coffers, which could be used by council to do all kinds of things and to keep property taxes down. And we also built a portfolio. The value of our portfolio was almost $250 million when we wrapped up the company at the end of the year. And we also were starting, and this was one of the newer initiatives, we were starting to develop income properties. So rather than kind of develop and sell, we were actually looking to hold and build this long-term revenue portfolio for the good of the city. But the ultimately we're a child of the city, and the new mayor, who actually was a predecessor to Diane Watts, and had always been somewhat critical of a number of her initiatives. When he came in, he felt that he said, "I like the initiatives you're doing. I really like what you're doing, but politically, I'm just not able to support a company that operates this far outside of City Hall." And so back in the spring, they made a decision to basically not to so much as to kill the company, but rather to take the activities that we are doing and bring them into City Hall. And so that's what we're in that process
Right.
of doing. So it is disappointing. I have actually a lot of time for the staff at City Hall. I think Surrey's got one of the most progressive bureaucracies actually in the country, and so I'm doing everything I can to support them as they make this transition. But it is going to be a little bit different. But I think, having said that, I think there is going to be a significant legacy. As I mentioned, we did a lot of work in the city center. We have a couple of really big projects which are in the planning stages, which hopefully we can keep some momentum. The city can keep some momentum on. We delivered a major mixed-use project, the tallest tower south of the river, which was a mixed-use building which had a new hotel and office space. Although in the end, the office space ended up being bought by Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Again, there is this huge demand for post-secondary education out there that they took advantage of, and then sort of condominiums on top of that. But that brought a new level of vitality to the city center, to add to the significant investments that the Diane Watts administration had made in the city center, which was moving City Hall there, building a new library, which built on the central city legacy as well. So I think the city center is now cemented as a thing. So hopefully it will be developed in a timely, effective way. The other thing, which is probably less glamorous, that SCDC did, was we did a lot of industrial development, and there's a huge shortage of industrial land in the Lower Mainland, and SCDC was responsible for bringing a lot of that new land on stream, and actually bringing in tenants and companies that would actually have a huge economic spin-off benefit for not just for Surrey, but for the entire region. So those are sort of two of the things that I think the industrial legacy and the city center legacy will be really with Surrey forever.
Are you looking for a specialized recruiting partner to connect you with the people who perform in commercial real estate? At Highview, we partner with some of Canada's leading real estate companies. From national landlords, institutional investors, REITs and service providers, to local developers, third parties, and private family businesses. We are passionate about the Canadian real estate industry and enjoy discussing what's happening in the market. We also provide insight and advice on hiring trends, compensation benchmarking, career roadmaps, networking opportunities, and much more. Visit us at highviewpartners.ca or contact us directly to discover how we can connect you to people who perform.
Okay, well, moving on, as I mentioned in your introduction, you'd spent over 20 years as a managing principal with Thom Architects and helped expand the practice into new markets. Bing unfortunately passed away in 2016, and the practice now goes by Reverie Architecture. But I wanted to ask about, I guess, your experience as a hiring manager. This is a real estate careers podcast after all. So when you were hiring at Thom, what were the three most important things that you would look for in a candidate?
Well, I think, and I think this doesn't just apply to architecture. This would be the same if you're working in any, if I was hiring, whether I was running a real estate company or an architectural practice. I mean, first there's, and this is a given, so it's not one of the three things, is you've got to, obviously they have to have the technical knowledge and the skills to technically do the job. But there's sort of three things that I'm always looking for and that I think will reflect a successful fit for the company. One, and perhaps this is because I come from the architectural business where creativity is kind of our bread and butter, but I think that's actually the true of any business, that you want people to be creative. And I think the ability to understand, to be able to think laterally and to have a wide perspective beyond just your area of expertise. And I always, and when I was hiring either at SCDC or at Bing Tom's, I was always interested in what people may have studied or practiced in aside from architecture, because I think if you have that perspective, I think that really makes you a better real estate developer, a better architect. So we used to say that all of our senior staff usually had two areas of expertise. Architecture was just one, but they were often not necessary. Sometimes it was an allied thing like landscape architecture or interior
Right.
design or something like that. But other times, in my case, it was economics, land economics. But I remember we had one woman, and hugely talented, who was a physiotherapist. But I think that sort of understanding of the human body, and basically
Yeah.
buildings have to be inhabited by people, and healthy lifestyle and stuff, that really enriched the architecture in such a big way. So that's the first one, is just having a broad perspective. The second one is making sure that they share the same values as the company. And that's very important for the company to really define what those values are, the real values, not just the sort of lip service values, but what it is, why you guys are in business and want to work. Because if you don't share the values, if there's somebody who's only preoccupied on maximizing profit and really doesn't give a care about anything else, then that's going to ultimately become a problem, no matter how brilliant they are at their job. And vice versa, if you find someone who really doesn't care about money, they only care about design or something like that, that's equally bad. So making sure that you have alignment with the values as much as possible, that's going to be really important. And then the third thing is communication. Because again, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are at what you do, if you can't communicate that really clearly and effectively, it's almost useless, or certainly the person is not going to advance in their career, and you really want to hire people that will advance and grow the company. So I used to say for architecture that quite aside from design, which again is a really important fundamental skill, but for me, finding architects that could communicate well. And I used to talk about, I used to be involved in the theater, and we did a fair bit of performing arts center work. And I always used to, in the theater, they talk about their show business. They talk about triple threats. If you can, you can dance and sing and act, you're a triple threat. If you can do all of those things. For architecture, I always said, well, if you can draw and you can present well verbally, and if you can write well, that you're a triple threat. That if you can do all of those things really well, your career is going to be tremendously successful. If you can do two of the three things, you'll still be very successful. But if you can really only do one of them, you're not going to be. You're going to have a very limited time. You're always going to be reliant on other people. And so communication skills are something I would emphasize as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer, the triple threat. So it's quite common these days for architects to make a switch from the design side to work directly for a developer, often as a development manager. In your experience, has this always been the case?
Well, I think if you go back 30 plus years, it probably was less of the case, but I think it's a trend that has been growing a lot. I think historically, well, if you just think of development, I mean, it's a lot of it has to do with financing. It's how to generate the money to allow you to do it, and to make sure that you can get a good return. And so historically, a lot of people have come out of kind of business training, even accounting, but that sort of strong financial skills. And certainly a lot of the big organized sort of pension fund type developers, that they tend to come from that background. The other background historically, which is still very much the case, is people that come from a construction background. Because if you think of the development process, the biggest chunk of money that gets spent, where there's the most risk, is during the construction phase. And so that's where things can go haywire or very well in your favor. So having a good knowledge of construction or having a company that has really grounded an understanding of construction is hugely important. So I think historically people have tended to come out of those two camps, and those camps continue to be very important. But I think as buildings have got more sophisticated, I think you're seeing more and more architects moving in. And one of the things about architecture is particularly if you're not an architect, you sort of tend to think of architecture as all about this kind of conceptual design and this sort of airy-fairy stuff. But in fact, if you look at an architectural contract, that only represents the first 10 to 15% of the project, of the work, of the contract. The balance of it has to do with technically figuring out how to build this thing. And that involves synthesizing all kinds of information from all kinds of other specialists, engineers, and so forth. And then actually administering the construction contract to make sure the right thing gets built. And so, in fact, those skills, if you look at that whole bundle of skills, is exactly what the developer needs, because it's people with an architectural background have that big picture and can actually understand the project from beginning to end, and can communicate, so they can actually be helpful advocates when people are trying to get approvals, what we call the entitlements for projects, to allow them to go ahead. And this is where it comes back to the communication skills that I was talking about before, that they understand what's involved in technically, documenting a building. So it's not going to cost too much money. It's going to be practical to build, and then they understand how to relate to a contractor to get things built. So that skill set is incredibly valuable for developers, and I think as buildings have got more sophisticated, some of the stuff we talked about earlier about some of these new generations of towers, having team members like that as a developer is incredibly valuable.
No, that's a great answer. What advice would you have for anyone starting out in the design or development industry at the moment?
I think it takes a while to learn the craft. I think don't be in too much of a rush. It takes time to learn, and it takes a while for projects to happen. I think what I tended to advise young architects, and I would say the same for people that want to go straight into real estate development, is ideally work for a company that does small projects, because small projects have a much faster metabolism. And so in a shorter period of time, you can actually get an understanding of these different phases of the project. And even though, big projects are different animals to some degree, they still have to go through the same phases of, design, approvals, documentation, construction, occupancy. And so if you can do that in a period of 3 or 4 years versus a period of 10 years, your career is going to sort of advance. So I would, my general advice is, even if it seems it's easy to get starstruck with the big companies doing the big, amazing projects, but in fact, if it comes down to trying to learn your craft early on, if you can work at a small scale for the first few years of your career, it's actually quite valuable.
Thank you. Okay, well, getting to know you a little bit more now, Michael. So what would people be most shocked to learn that you're great at?
I mean, honestly, I don't think people would be particularly shocked about anything. I think I try to be the same kind of person, whether I'm dealing with a colleague or a client or a community or a parent. I'm sort of, I think I'm the same person and have the sort of same set of values. So I don't think anyone would be surprised. Certainly one of my great loves, and I had to make a hard decision to leave it behind when I went into architecture, was the theater world. I'd love to sort of produce theater. And I don't know if I'd be really good at it if I'd kept it up, but I certainly love doing it.
All right. Well, okay. We'll wrap up with 5 quick-fire questions. So number 1, what's the one place, in fact, you mentioned this, maybe you can pick another answer. What's the one place you take guests who are visiting Vancouver from out of town?
Well, it tends not to be a building, although the Museum of Anthropology is up there. But I think what makes Vancouver unique is its relationship with nature. And so what we tend to do is, when we have visitors, is we show how we basically show off nature by showing them the city. So it'd be a bike ride along we've got fantastic bike routes through the city now. So bike routes, walking on the beach, all of that, views of them going up into the mountains. But that's what makes Vancouver unique from other cities, is our relationship with nature. And so that's what we tend to want to show off.
Yeah. Okay. Number 2, what's the most important thing you learned working alongside Bing Thom for all those years?
I think always be open-minded. Don't go in with any preconceptions when you've been asked to look at a project. It's really important to start from first principles. He always used to say it's more important to figure out what questions you should ask than think about the answers to begin with, and that's been very good advice.
Number 3, where would you build your dream home?
Well, somewhere in Vancouver. I think I've lived in Kitsilano all my time in Vancouver, and I love the neighborhood and the relationship to the city. So somewhere in Kits would be great.
Okay. In what country, Michael, do you find the most design inspiration?
I think of the world, and maybe this is because I'm an architect, but not in terms of countries, but in terms of cities. And I don't think I've been to a city I don't like. I think every city, when people come together and live in close proximity, there's just some kinds of magic happens, and there's always something interesting. And so and for me, and partly because Vancouver it's easy to find nature in Vancouver. It's sometimes a little hard to find the city. I do like to go to big cities, but I have no particular favorites. But certainly, the old Western European cities, London, Paris, Rome. There's always things you can learn from places like that. The big American cities, Chicago, New York, LA. There's lessons there. But even going to Australia a little while ago, to Melbourne and Sydney. There's amazing things there, and Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo. Those are all cities that we have something to learn for. So I don't have a favorite, and I like to go back to some of these big cities because they're always evolving and changing. But
yeah, of course.
But to me, any city is worth a visit.
Yeah. Well, okay, then this might be a tough final question, but what's the one place you'd like to visit post-COVID? What would be the first place you'll be heading to?
It'll be a city, and so it will probably be somewhere like London or New York.
Michael, really appreciate you giving us a history lesson today and telling us a bit more about what you were up to in Surrey, and your really helpful lessons. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers podcast brought to you by Highview Partners, a talent search and recruitment firm focused exclusively on Canadian real estate. If your real estate team is looking to find the best next hire, or if you're ready to make the best next move in your career, then reach out to Highview Partners today. Follow us on LinkedIn and visit us at highviewpartners.ca.